we can finally bring them home.
February 1944. Over Leipzig, Germany, a formation of 30 B-17 bombers burns against the winter sky. Inside the lead fortress, Bombardier Lieutenant James Howard watches two crewmen bail out their parachutes shredded by cannon fire before they hit the ground. Through his headset, he hears the pilot's last transmission. They're everywhere. We can't. Then static. 60 aircraft lost in one afternoon. 600 men dead or captured. The American daylight bombing campaign is bleeding to death at 25,000 feet, until a silver ghost appears on the horizon. Wright Field, Ohio, April 1942. The prototype sat abandoned in Hangar 7 at Wright-Patterson Army Airfield, dust gathering on its polished aluminum skin. P-51 Mustang. Serial number 41038. Outside, spring rain drummed against the corrugated steel roof, while inside 3 Army Air Force colonels circled the aircraft like judges at a livestock auction studying a lame horse. Maximum speed, 370 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. Colonel Marcus Bennett read from his clipboard, his voice flat with disappointment. That's slower than the P-40 Warhawk we've been flying since Pearl Harbor. Colonel Raymond Walsh kicked one of the landing gear tires. And look at this engine, Allison V1710. Same power plant as the P-40. Why are we wasting time on this when we could be building more Thunderbolts? The third officer, Major Robert Chilton, peered into the cockpit. North American Aviation built this in 120 days. 120 days from contract to first flight. That's impressive, at least. Impressive. Bennett's laugh echoed through the empty hangar. The British ordered this plane out of desperation because they couldn't get enough Spitfires. Now they're stuck with 1,300 aircraft they don't want. Rate of climb is pathetic. Service ceiling barely reaches 30,000 feet. Any German pilot flying a Messerschmitt Bf 109 or Focke-Wulf 190 will dance circles around this thing. Walsh pulled out a Lucky Strike, lit it, and exhaled slowly. I flew against the Luftwaffe over France in 1940 before they shipped me home for training duties. Those German pilots aren't academy boys playing war games. They're veterans with 500, 600 combat hours. Some of them have been fighting since Spain in '36. They know every trick, every angle, every weakness. And this, he gestured dismissively at the Mustang. This won't survive 5 minutes against them. What none of these officers knew, what they couldn't possibly know, was that 190 miles east in a nondescript office at North American Aviation's Inglewood, California facility, Chief Aerodynamicist Edgar Schmude was already drafting modifications that would transform this failure into the most lethal fighter aircraft of the war. But that April morning in Ohio, all they saw was disappointment. "Stick with the Thunderbolts," Bennett said, closing his folder with finality. "At least those have the range and firepower to escort our bombers partway into Germany. This Mustang is a ground attack aircraft at best. Low altitude work, strafing runs, nothing more." The 3 men walked toward the hangar doors, their footsteps echoing off concrete. Behind them, the Mustang sat silent in the shadows, sentenced to obsolescence before its career had even begun. The problem that would kill thousands. 600 miles east, at 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe, England. Brigadier General Ira Eaker stared at casualty reports that would have broken lesser men. The numbers told a story of systematic slaughter. August 17, 1943. Mission to Schweinfurt and Regensburg, Germany. Objective: destroy ball-bearing factories critical to German war production. Result: 60 B-17 bombers destroyed. 600 men killed, wounded, or captured. 27% loss rate. Strategically unsustainable. Morally devastating. October 14, 1943. Second Schweinfurt raid. 60 more bombers lost. Another 600 casualties. The men had started calling it Black Thursday. Crew morale was collapsing faster than the bomber formations under Luftwaffe guns. Eaker pulled out a flask of bourbon against regulations, but these were not normal times and took a long drink. Through his office window, he could see maintenance crews working under floodlights on a row of B-17s, patching bullet holes, replacing shattered plexiglass, scrubbing blood from turret positions. The mathematics of destruction were brutally simple. Every B-17 carried 10 men. Every mission deep into Germany cost 50 to 70 aircraft, 700 casualties per raid. At that rate, the entire 8th Air Force would be dead or captured within 6 months. The problem wasn't courage. American air crews had courage in abundance. The problem was physics and geometry. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, despite its name, was not a fortress. Its 50 caliber machine guns could theoretically create overlapping fields of fire when bombers flew in tight formation. But theoretically meant nothing when Luftwaffe fighters attacked from 12 o'clock high, diving through the formation at closing speeds of 500 miles per hour, firing 20mm and 30mm cannons that could tear a bomber's wing off with a single 3-second burst. And the American escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts and British Spitfires, could only escort bombers about 300 miles into Germany before fuel limitations forced them to turn back. Beyond that radius, called the fighter line, the bombers flew alone into what the crews grimly called Indian country. That's when the Luftwaffe struck. German fighter controllers on the ground tracked American bomber formations with radar, waited until the escorts departed, then vectored in Jagdgeschwader squadrons hunting wings to tear the undefended bombers apart. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s attacked in waves of 30 or 40 aircraft. Their pilots veterans who'd been killing since Poland in 1939. "Sir." A young lieutenant knocked on Eaker's door. "Casualty lists from today's mission to Bremen." Eaker took the clipboard. His hands didn't shake anymore when reading these reports. That worried him more than anything else, that he was becoming numb to mass death. 42 aircraft missing. 420 men. Some bailed out and were captured. Some crashed and died on impact. Some burned alive inside their aircraft, trapped by G-forces as their bombers spiraled toward Earth. And some, the ones that haunted Eaker's dreams, were blown apart so completely that no bodies were ever recovered. Just pink mist in the stratosphere, frozen instantly at 40 below zero. "Thank you, Lieutenant." Dismissed. Alone again, Eaker returned to the window. Outside, a ground crew was painting another bomb symbol on a B-17's nose, the aircraft's 25th mission. Statistically, only 1 in 4 bombers survived to fly 25 missions. Those that did were sent home, their crews released from combat duty as a reward for what the Air Force euphemistically called tour completion. The bomber was named Memphis Belle. Its crew had 3 missions left. Eaker found himself whispering a prayer he no longer believed would be answered. Let them make it. Just let those 10 men make it home. He knew that 300 miles into Germany, there would be no one to protect them. The desperate British experiment. While American bombers died over Germany, a small group of British engineers at Rolls-Royce's facility in Hucknall, England, were conducting an experiment that would change the war. Ronald Harker, chief test pilot for Rolls-Royce, had flown the P-51 Mustang with its American Allison engine and immediately recognized both its potential and its fatal flaw. The airframe was brilliant low-drag laminar flow wings, efficient fuselage design, excellent handling characteristics. But the Allison V-1710 engine lost power above 15,000 feet, strangling the aircraft's performance at precisely the altitudes where air combat occurred. What if Harker had proposed to Rolls-Royce chief engineer Ernest Hives, "We take out the Allison and install our Merlin 61. The Merlin 61 was the 2-stage, 2-speed supercharged engine that powered the legendary Spitfire Mach-9, the fighter that had helped win the Battle of Britain. It produced 1,440 horsepower at 25,000 feet, exactly where the Mustang needed it most. Hives had authorized the experiment in October 1942. By April 1943, the first Merlin-powered Mustang was ready for testing. Harker strapped into the cockpit on a cold morning, ran through his pre-flight checks, and advanced the throttle. The Merlin's distinctive roar, deeper and more powerful than the Allison's, shook the airframe. He released the brakes and the Mustang leaped forward, lifting off after just 800 feet of runway. What happened next entered aviation legend. Harker climbed to 25,000 feet and pushed the throttle to maximum power. The airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour. 410, 420, 437 miles per hour, at 25,000 feet 40 miles per hour, faster than any other fighter at that altitude. He rolled the aircraft into a series of combat maneuvers, Immelman turns barrel rolls, high G turns that would have torn the wings off lesser designs. The Mustang handled like a dream. Responsive, stable, deadly. Then Harker tested range. With external drop tanks, the Mustang could fly 1,650 miles, enough to escort bombers from England to Berlin, and back with fuel to spare for combat. No other fighter on Earth could match that combination of speed, maneuverability, and range. When Harker landed, he shut down the engine and sat in the cockpit for a long moment, his hands still gripping the control stick. Then he climbed out, walked to the engineering office, and said 6 words that would doom the Luftwaffe. "Gentlemen, we've just won the war." Gentlemen, we've... The man who saw it coming, Oberst Adolf Gehlen, general of the fighter arm for the Luftwaffe, stood on the tarmac at Javer Airfield in northwestern Germany, watching a Jagdgeschwader 26 squadron return from intercepting American bombers. Of the 12 Focke-Wulf FW-190s that had taken off 3 hours earlier, 9 landed. 2 were trailing smoke. 1 pilot was dead in his cockpit, killed by a .50 caliber round through the canopy, but kept aloft by his squadron mates until they reached friendly territory. 3 aircraft lost, 7 damaged. In exchange, they'd shot down 5 B-17s. Gehlen did the mathematics instantly. The Americans were building bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down. And now reports were coming in about a new escort fighter, silver fast, with range that shouldn't be possible. "What did you see out there?" Gehlen asked Hauptmann Johannes Naumann, a 26-year-old ace with 43 confirmed kills. Naumann pulled off his leather helmet, his face gray with exhaustion. "Something new, Herr Oberst. We engaged the Thunderbolts as usual and forced them to turn back. Then we hit the bomber formation near Osnabrück. We were making our attack run when they appeared, maybe 20 fighters coming out of the sun. At first I thought they were Thunderbolts lagging behind, but they were faster, much faster." "Did you engage?" "I tried." Naumann's voice dropped. "I dove on one from above, perfect bounce, 200-meter advantage. He saw me, broke left and climbed. Herr Oberst, he climbed through me like I was standing still. By the time I rolled to follow, he was 600 meters above, reversing, and I had to dive away, or he would have killed me." Gehlen lit a cigarette, his mind racing through tactical implications. "What did it look like, Bit?" "Silver. Inline engine, so probably not another radial engine Thunderbolt. Distinctive bubble canopy. And the range..." Naumann paused. "We were 300 kilometers inside Germany. No American fighter should be there. But there they were." That night, Gehlen composed a report to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe. He knew Göring wouldn't listen. The man was delusional, still believing Germany was winning, but protocol demanded he try. "American industry has produced a fighter that combines the range of a transport aircraft with the performance of a frontline interceptor. If deployed in numbers, this aircraft will achieve air superiority over the Reich. I recommend immediate production increases of the Me-262 jet fighter as our only viable countermeasure. We have perhaps 6 months before the situation becomes irreversible." Göring's response arrived 3 days later, handwritten on official stationery. "Gehlen, you have become defeatist and paranoid. The Führer assures me American industry is exhausted and their pilots are poorly trained cowards. Continue destroying their bombers. This wonder weapon you fear is propaganda fiction. Do not waste my time with cowardice disguised as tactical assessment." Galland crumpled the letter and threw it in the trash. 6 months, he thought. We have 6 months before they control our skies completely, and no one with the power to change our fate will listen. The Ghost Appears. December 20th, 1943. 27,000 feet above Bremen, Germany. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler of Jagdgeschwader 27 rolled his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 into attack position. His eyes locked on a crippled B-17, struggling to stay aloft. The bomber had dropped out of formation, trailing smoke from 2 engines, its tail section shredded by flak. Easy kill. Stigler had been flying combat missions since 1940. Africa, Russia. Now the defense of the Reich. He had 22 confirmed kills and wore the Knight's Cross around his neck. He knew how to kill efficiently and without hesitation. But as he closed to 300 meters, he saw the bomber's defensive gunners slumped in their positions, dead or unconscious. The top turret was destroyed, just twisted metal and blood-stained plexiglass. Through the torn fuselage, he could see men moving inside, trying desperately to save their aircraft. Stigler's training said, "Destroy the enemy." But his honor, the code he'd learned from his older brother August, a World War I fighter ace, said something different. He pulled alongside the bomber instead of shooting. Through his canopy, he made eye contact with the pilot, a young American whose face was pale with shock and fear. Stigler pointed down toward neutral Sweden, only 60 miles north. "Fly there. Surrender to the Swedes. Live." The American pilot nodded, understanding, passing between enemies who, in another universe, might have been friends. Stigler escorted the bomber toward the North Sea, protecting it from other German fighters who approached. When they reached the coast, he saluted, broke away, and returned to base. He never reported the encounter. To do so would mean court-martial and execution for defeatism or cowardice in the face of the enemy. Some codes run deeper than national flags. But as Stigler landed at Jever Airfield that evening, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Parked on the auxiliary field were 2 wrecked aircraft, both silver, both with the distinctive lines of the new American fighter that was appearing more frequently over Germany. He walked over to examine them. Shot down during morning patrols. The first had taken cannon fire through the engine, but had managed to glide to German territory before crashing. The pilot had been killed on impact. The second had been rammed by a FW-190 in a desperate kamikaze attack, both pilots dead. Stigler studied the wreckage with a mechanic's eye. The airframe was beautifully designed, smooth, aerodynamic, efficient. The 650 caliber machine guns in the wings could shred any German fighter. And the fuel tanks. He counted 3 internal tanks, plus plumbing for external drop tanks. "How far can this fly?" he asked the ground crew chief. The sergeant consulted a captured technical manual written in English. According to this, with external tanks, approximately 2,650 kilometers. Stigler did the conversion to miles in his head. 1,650 miles. From England to Berlin and back, with fuel for combat. He looked up at the darkening winter sky where stars were beginning to emerge. Somewhere up there, more of these silver ghosts were being built in American factories he couldn't reach, crewed by pilots he couldn't kill, preparing to destroy everything he'd spent 4 years defending. For the first time since 1940, Franz Stigler understood Germany was going to lose the war. Not because of tactics or courage or skill, but because the Americans had built a machine that could be everywhere all the time, and Germany didn't have the industry or resources to counter it. "What do they call this aircraft?" he asked the sergeant. "P-51 Mustang, Herr Oberleutnant." Stigler nodded slowly, memorizing the name of the weapon that would destroy his nation. "Get used to seeing them," he said quietly, "because soon they'll own the sky." The B-17 named Destiny's Child lifted off from Thorpe Abbott's airfield at 0647 hours on January 11, 1944, carrying 10 men who knew the statistics better than their own birthdays. 1 in 4 wouldn't complete 25 missions. 1 in 5 wouldn't survive their first week. The odds improved slightly if you made it past Mission 5, but not enough to matter when Messerschmitts came screaming through your formation at closing speeds that gave you 3 seconds to live or die. Second Lieutenant William "Billy" Hartman sat in the left seat, hands steady on the yoke, despite the fact that this was his 3rd mission and he'd watched 2 friends burn to death over Emden 6 days earlier. His co-pilot, Lieutenant James Morrison, chain-smoked Lucky Strikes with hands that trembled just enough to betray the fear he wouldn't acknowledge aloud. "Tighten up on Red Leader," Hartman said into the intercom, his voice flat and professional. Behind him in the aircraft's cramped interior, 8 other men checked guns, tested oxygen systems, and thought about home with an intensity that felt like prayer. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen Ball, turret gunner, was 20 years old and had lied about his age to enlist after Pearl Harbor. His parents ran a grocery store in San Francisco's Chinatown. They didn't know their son now spent 6 hours at a time curled in a plexiglass sphere underneath a bomber watching other aircraft explode while praying the landing gear wouldn't malfunction and crush him on touchdown. Technical Sergeant Marcus Johnson, top turret gunner, was from Detroit. His father worked the Ford assembly line. His mother cleaned houses for white families in Grosse Pointe. He'd joined the Army Air Force because it was the only branch that would let a black man kill Nazis instead of just cooking their meals, and now he manned twin 50 caliber guns while German fighters tried to kill him for being American instead of for being black, which he considered progress of a kind. They crossed the English coast at 0723 hours, climbing to 25,000 feet, where the temperature dropped to 42 degrees below zero, and every breath through the oxygen mask felt like inhaling razors. Below them, the North Sea looked gray and infinite, and every man knew that ditching meant death within 5 minutes of hitting that freezing water. "Escorts breaking off," Morrison said, pointing to where the P-47 Thunderbolts were peeling away their fuel gauges, reading half empty at the 300-mile limit. "We're on our own now." Hartman keyed the intercom. "Gunners heads up. Indian country starts now." For 18 minutes, nothing happened. The bomber formation droned east through empty sky, and the silence was worse than combat because it gave you time to think about the statistics about the newspaper back home that would say "missing in action" instead of explaining how you'd been blown into pieces so small they never found enough of you to bury. Then, Chen's voice cracked through the intercom high and tight with adrenaline. "Fighters 11 o'clock, high 12. No 15 of them." The Messerschmitts came out of the sun like sharks sensing blood. Bf 109 G6s painted in mottled gray-green camouflage, flown by pilots who'd been killing since France fell in 1940. They dove through the formation in line abreast 4 aircraft wide, their 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns, creating a wall of fire that shredded aluminum and flesh with equal efficiency. The B-17 flying 50 feet off their right wing, Devil's Daughter, piloted by a kid from Nebraska named Tommy Chen, who'd gotten drunk with Hartman 3 nights ago and confessed he was terrified of dying. A virgin took a direct hit through the cockpit. The plexiglass exploded inward. The pilots died instantly. The bomber rolled inverted and fell trailing fire, and Hartman counted 4 parachutes before it disappeared into the clouds below. "Brake right! Brake right!" someone screamed over the radio, and Hartman threw the yoke over, knowing he couldn't break formation, but unable to stop himself, the instinct for survival overriding training. Morrison grabbed the yoke and wrestled the bomber back into position. "Hold formation." The squadron commander's voice crackled through static. "Maintain formation, or we're all dead." Johnson's top turret roared the twin 50 calibers, hammering so loud that Hartman felt it through his seat. Spent brass casings rained down through the flight deck. The smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid, and fear sweat filled the cabin. A Focke-Wulf 190 flashed past the nose so close Hartmann could see the pilot's face, young concentrated professional. The German fighter rolled inverted, pulled through, and came back for another pass. Johnson tracked him, fired a 2-second burst, and the FW-190's left wing shredded. The German fighter snap-rolled, and disintegrated pieces tumbling earthward like confetti. "Got him! I got him!" Johnson shouted, his voice cracking with a combination of exhilaration and horror at having just killed another human being. But 3 more German fighters immediately replaced the one Johnson had killed, and Hartmann understood with sudden clarity that this wasn't combat, it was mathematics. The Luftwaffe could afford to trade 1 fighter for 1 bomber all day, because America was sending the bombers, and Germany was defending their homeland, and men defending home fought harder than men prosecuting conquest. The bombardier, Lieutenant David Kowalski from Pittsburgh, called up from the nose. "Lead bombers hit. He's going down." The formation, lead aircraft rolled slowly onto its back, both inboard engines streaming fire. Hartmann watched 9 men bail out. He counted them, forcing himself to witness, and then the B-17 exploded in a ball of orange flame that briefly illuminated the winter clouds like a second sun. With the lead bomber gone, the formation began to drift apart. Tactical discipline collapsed under the weight of terror. Individual aircraft broke left or right, seeking safety in maneuver, finding only death. German fighters swarmed the stragglers like wolves culling wounded deer. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered, watching another B-17 lose its entire tail section to a concentrated cannon burst. The bomber pitched forward into a vertical dive, spinning, and Hartmann knew no one inside was conscious anymore. The G-forces would have knocked them out instantly. For 43 minutes, the killing continued. The German fighters attacked in waves coordinated through ground controllers who vectored fresh squadrons into the fight as others broke off to rearm and refuel. The Americans had no one to call for help. The escorts were already back in England, landing their pilots sitting in debriefing rooms, drinking coffee, while men were dying 300 miles east. By the time they reached the initial point for their bomb run, Schweinfurt, a city whose name already appeared in nightmares, the formation had lost 17 aircraft, 170 men, some dead, some falling through 25,000 feet of freezing air with parachutes that sometimes opened and sometimes didn't. Some trapped inside crippled bombers riding them down because the centrifugal force of the spin pinned them to their stations. "Bomb bay doors open," Kowalski announced, his voice mechanical with shock. The doors rumbled open, and the airspeed dropped as drag increased. German fighters immediately intensified their attacks, knowing bombers on the bomb run couldn't maneuver, couldn't deviate, couldn't do anything except fly straight and level and die. Flak began bursting around them, 88mm anti-aircraft shells that created black clouds of shrapnel, moving at 3,000 feet per second. Each burst sounded like someone hitting the fuselage with a sledgehammer. A piece of shrapnel punched through the cockpit roof 6 inches from Hartmann's head, and he felt the pressure wave as it passed. Steady. Steady. Kowalski was using the Norden bomb sight now, making tiny corrections. Steady. Bombs away. The aircraft lurched upward as 12 500-pound bombs dropped free. Hartmann immediately threw the bomber into a hard left turn, abandoning the formation, seeking the protection of the clouds below. Protocol was to maintain formation, but protocol was written by men who weren't being shot at by veterans who'd spent 4 years perfecting the art of killing. They dove through 8,000 feet of winter clouds, the airframe shaking, ice forming on the wings, Morrison reading off airspeed and altitude in a monotone that suggested he'd gone somewhere else mentally. Somewhere these things weren't happening. When they broke out beneath the cloud deck at 12,000 feet, they were alone. No formation, no other bombers. Just one B-17 over Germany, with enough fuel to make it home if no one shot them, and if the weather cooperated, and if God decided to pay attention to the prayers of men who'd just killed an unknown number of German factory workers. "Chen, you still with us?" Hartmann called to the ball turret. Silence. "Chen?" "Yeah." The voice was small and distant. "Yeah, I'm here. There's something on my window. I think it's someone's blood. From another plane. We flew through someone." No one responded because there was nothing to say to that. They'd all seen things that morning that would replay behind their eyelids for the rest of their lives, however long that turned out to be. The flight back took 3 hours and 14 minutes. German fighters found them twice more, but each time Morrison managed to lose them in cloud banks or by diving toward the deck where the Messerschmitt's high-altitude superchargers became liabilities. They crossed the English coast at 14:47 hours. Fuel gauges reading almost empty, hydraulics damaged. The number 3 engine seized, and every man aboard wondering how they'd survived when so many hadn't. Hartman lined up on the runway at Thorpe Abbotts and brought the bomber in with the delicate touch of someone defusing a bomb. The landing gear held. The brakes worked. The aircraft rolled to a stop near the hardstand, and for a long moment, no one moved. Then Morrison started laughing, high, hysterical, breaking into sobs. Hartman found his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't unbuckle his harness. Behind them, Chen radioed that he was stuck in the ball turret, the manual crank had jammed, and he'd been trapped in that plexiglass coffin for 6 hours, imagining what would happen if the landing gear collapsed. The ground crew got Chen out. The 10 men of Destiny's Child stood on the tarmac in the cold English afternoon, while maintenance personnel counted 213 holes in their aircraft. The intelligence officer asked questions about enemy aircraft types, attack patterns, bomb damage assessment. Hartman answered mechanically while watching other bombers land, counting them, doing the mathematics of death. 38 aircraft had departed Thorpe Abbotts that morning. 22 returned. 16 bombers lost. 160 men. In one mission. In one morning. For one target that German workers would repair within 2 weeks. That night in the officers' club, Hartman sat alone with a glass of bourbon he couldn't drink. Morrison had gone to the medical tent for sleeping pills. Johnson was in the enlisted men's barracks writing a letter home that he'd never send, because how do you explain to your mother that you killed a man and felt nothing except relief that he'd died instead of you? Major Robert Wilson, the squadron operations officer, sat down across from Hartman without asking. Wilson had completed 23 missions. His eyes had the flat, dead look of someone who'd seen too much death and stopped processing it as anything except data. "You did good today," Wilson said. Hartman laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "We lost 16 crews. How is that good? You brought your crew home. That's all that matters." Wilson pulled out a pack of cigarettes, offered one to Hartman, lit both. "Listen, I'm not supposed to tell you this, but there's something coming. New escort fighter. Long range. They're saying it can go all the way to Berlin." "I've heard that before," Hartman said. "They told us the Thunderbolts would protect us. They can't even make it to the German border." "This is different. British tested it last month. Rolls-Royce engine in an American airframe. Supposed to be faster than anything the Germans have, with enough range to stay with us the whole mission." "When?" Wilson shrugged. "Soon. Couple months maybe. Maybe sooner if the losses keep stacking up like today." Hartman stubbed out his cigarette and stood. "Too late for Tommy Chen. Too late for the 160 guys we lost today. But maybe it'll be in time for the next poor bastards they send over Germany." He walked out into the English darkness, where stars were invisible behind perpetual clouds, and tried to remember what it felt like to believe you'd survive the war. The memory wouldn't come. Instead, all he saw was that B-17 exploding, 9 men bailing out, counting them, forcing himself to witness, because someone needed to remember they'd existed. Behind him, Wilson sat alone in the officers' club and thought about the classified briefing he'd attended last week. The new fighter was real. It was already in production. And if the intelligence estimates were correct by spring, the Silver Mustangs would fill the sky from England to Berlin. But spring was 3 months away, and tomorrow morning another mission was scheduled, and more men would climb into bombers, knowing the statistics, knowing the odds, knowing that somewhere over Germany They'd cross an invisible line where their escorts would abandon them and the Luftwaffe would be waiting. Wilson poured himself another drink and wondered how many more names he'd have to cross off the duty roster before the miracle arrived. The miracle arrived on a transport ship 3 weeks after Hartman watched Tommy Chen die, packed in wooden crates marked agricultural equipment, to confuse German intelligence. Captain Charles McGee. 302nd Fighter Group stood on the dock at Liverpool on February 3, 1944, watching longshoremen unload the crates with forklifts that groaned under weight that shouldn't belong to farming tools. Agricultural equipment, McGee said to his wingman, Lieutenant Robert Williams. That's what they're calling 60 P-51 Mustangs now. Williams grinned, though his eyes stayed sharp and calculating. The 332nd was one of only 2 all-black fighter groups in the Army Air Force, and every man in the unit knew they were fighting 2 wars, one against Germany, one against a country that made them use separate bathrooms at the base in Alabama where they'd trained. They'd arrived in Italy 6 months ago flying P-40 Warhawks obsolete aircraft the white units didn't want, and had lost 11 pilots proving they could fight as well as anyone. Now they were being re-equipped with the best fighter America had built, and McGee understood what that meant. The brass didn't give you the best equipment unless they needed you to do something other units couldn't. You know why they're giving us Mustangs? Williams asked. McGee nodded. Because bomber crews don't care what color their escorts are. They just want someone who'll stay with them all the way to the target and back. At 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe, Brigadier General Ira Eaker was telling his staff officers the same thing in slightly different language. Gentlemen, the losses are unsustainable. We lost 468 bombers in January alone. That's 4,600 men. If we continue at this rate, the 8th Air Force will cease to exist as a functional combat unit by summer. Lieutenant Colonel William Kepner, commanding the 8th Fighter Command, spread reconnaissance photographs across the conference table. The Germans have figured out our tactics. They wait beyond the escort range, mass their fighters, and hit us with everything they have. Our P-47 groups are doing good work, but they simply don't have the legs to escort bombers deep into Germany. What about the Mustangs? Eaker asked. First Squadron becomes operational next week. Based on British test data, they should be able to escort all the way to Berlin with fuel for 30 minutes of combat. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine solved every performance problem the Allison version had. Eaker studied the photographs, bombers falling in flames, parachutes dotting winter skies, crash sites scattered across Germany like dropped coins. Each crash site represented 10 men, 10 families receiving telegrams, 10 mothers who'd never see their sons again. How fast can we get more Mustangs to the operational squadrons? North American Aviation is producing them as fast as they can retool the assembly lines. Right now we're getting about 40 aircraft per week. By April, production should hit 150 per week. That's not fast enough. Sir, with respect, it's faster than any other aircraft program in history. The problem isn't production, it's training pilots to fly them effectively. Eaker lit a cigarette and walked to the window overlooking the base. Outside, ground crews worked on a damaged B-17 patching holes that looked like someone had attacked the aircraft with a sledgehammer. Then get the experienced pilots transitioned first. Pull them off Thunderbolt duty. I want every P-51 group operational by March. 200 miles northeast at Debden Airfield in Essex. Major Don Gentile was discovering what the Mustang could do when you stopped treating it like a normal fighter and started treating it like a weapon that rewrote the rules. Gentile had 21 confirmed kills flying Spitfires and P-47s. He was 23 years old from Piqua, Ohio, and he flew with the casual aggression of someone who'd internalized the mathematics of aerial combat so completely that dogfighting had become instinct rather than thought. Okay, listen up, he told his squadron during the pre-mission briefing on March 3, 1944. The Mustang has 500 miles more range than the Thunderbolt. That means we can do something the Germans aren't expecting. We can hunt them. Captain John Godfrey Gentile's wingman raised his hand. I thought we're supposed to stay with the bombers. We are. Until we've got them safely to the target. Then we go weapons free and kill everything that moves. Gentile tapped the mission map. The Luftwaffe has been setting up fighter assembly areas here, and here about 20 miles outside the bomber route waiting for our escorts to leave. They're predictable. They're complacent. And starting today, they're dead. The mission launched at 0830 hours 48 P-51 Mustangs, escorting 216 B-17s to Berlin. It was the first American raid on the German capital, and every pilot knew the Luftwaffe would throw everything they had at the formation. Gentile's squadron rendezvoused with the bombers at 15,000 feet over the Dutch coast. He slid his Mustang into position 500 feet above and behind the lead bomber element, close enough to protect them far enough out to maneuver if German fighters appeared. For 90 minutes, nothing happened. The formation droned east through winter sky, and Gentile used the time to study his aircraft, learning its sounds and vibrations, the way a musician learns an instrument. The Merlin engine's roar was different from the radial engines he'd flown before, smoother, more refined with power that built progressively rather than hitting all at once. The controls responded with precision that felt supernatural. Touch the stick, and the aircraft moved exactly where you intended. No lag, no mushiness, just pure mechanical empathy between pilot and machine. "Bandits," someone called over the radio. 12 o'clock high, 30 plus. Gentile saw them instantly, a Luftwaffe Jagdgeschwader forming up for a classic bounce, diving from 28,000 feet with the sun behind them. Standard tactics. Effective tactics. Tactics that assumed American escorts would be low on fuel by now and unable to climb effectively. But Gentile's Mustang climbed like it had rockets attached. He pushed the throttle to maximum power, pulled back on the stick, and pointed the nose at the German formation 6,000 feet above. The airspeed indicator wound down as altitude increased, but the Merlin's two-stage supercharger kept feeding compressed air into the engine, maintaining power at altitudes where the old Allison would have been gasping. The German formation leader saw him coming and apparently couldn't believe what he was seeing, an American fighter climbing through them matching their altitude, refusing to be bounced. The German broke left, trying to extend away, and Gentile followed. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 was fast. The Mustang was faster. The German pulled into a climbing turn, trying to use superior turning radius. The Mustang stayed glued to his 6 o'clock Gentile's finger, resting on the trigger, waiting for the shot to develop. At 29,000 feet, the German made a mistake. He reversed his turn, trying to scissors back across Gentile's nose. The maneuver would have worked against a Thunderbolt or even a Spitfire. Against the Mustang, it was suicide. Gentile rolled with him, pulled lead, and fired a 2-second burst. The 650 caliber machine guns converged their fire at 250 yards, exactly where the Messerschmitt was flying. The German fighter's canopy exploded. The aircraft snap-rolled, inverted, and fell, trailing smoke and pieces of airframe. Splash 1. Gentile transmitted his voice calm, as if discussing the weather. He looked around for his wingman. Godfrey was 300 yards behind, engaged with another Bf-109. The German was good. He'd reversed twice, and was now in Godfrey's rear quarter, trying to get guns on target. Gentile Dove cut across the turn and came up underneath the German fighter. He didn't fire. Didn't need to. The Messerschmitt pilot saw him coming, panicked, broke off the attack, and dove away at full throttle. Gentile followed. They descended through 20,000 feet, 15,000, 10,000. The German was running for home throttle to the firewall, hoping speed alone would save him. But the Mustang was still gaining. At 8,000 feet, Gentile closed to within 300 yards, centered the reticle, and fired. The Messerschmitt's left wing folded upward and tore free. The aircraft tumbled, disintegrating as it fell. Gentile didn't see a parachute. 2, he said into the radio. The entire engagement had taken 8 minutes. The bomber formation hadn't lost a single aircraft. By the time Gentile's squadron landed at Debden that evening, they'd shot down 17 German fighters without losing a single Mustang. Intelligence officers crowded the debriefing room, asking questions, taking notes, beginning to understand that something fundamental had shifted in the air war. Major James Howard, commanding the 354th Fighter Squadron, had experienced the same thing on a mission to Oschersleben 3 weeks earlier. His squadron had been escorting bombers when 30 German fighters attacked. Howard's wingman had engine trouble and turned back, leaving Howard alone against impossible odds. Most pilots would have broken off, protected themselves, accepted that you can't save everyone. Howard had stayed. For 37 minutes, he'd fought alone against the entire German formation, diving through them, breaking up their attacks, shooting down 3 Bf-109s, and damaging 4 more. He'd emptied his guns, run his fuel down to vapor, and landed with his aircraft so shot up that maintenance declared it unflyable. When asked why he'd stayed, Howard had said simply, "They were trying to kill my bombers. That's my job to stop them." He received the Medal of Honor 3 weeks later, the only fighter pilot in the European theater to earn it. But what mattered more than the medal was what his action proved: a single Mustang pilot with enough skill and determination could change the outcome of an entire battle. The Luftwaffe had been built around the cult of the individual acemen like Adolf Galland and Johannes Steinhoff, who'd racked up hundreds of kills through personal virtuosity. America was building something different. A system where the aircraft, the tactics, the logistics, and the industrial base all worked together to create overwhelming superiority that no amount of individual skill could counter. At Jever Airfield in Germany, Franz Stigler was learning this the hard way. His squadron had engaged American bombers 7 times in February. 7 times the Silver Mustangs had appeared. 7 times German pilots had died. On March 8th, Stigler led his Staffel against a bomber formation heading to Berlin. They'd barely started their attack run when the Mustangs hit them from above. Stigler saw his wingman explode, saw another Bf-109 spin away with its tail shot off, saw a third pilot bail out with his flight suit on fire. He managed to shoot down one Mustang, saw it go down trailing smoke, but the victory felt hollow when 4 of his own pilots didn't return. That night, he sat in the operations room with the survivors drinking schnapps that didn't dull the reality staring them in the face. On the wall was a chart tracking Luftwaffe losses. January 340 aircraft, February 405 aircraft, March, and they were only 8 days in, already 213 aircraft destroyed. "We're being bled to death," Hauptmann Klaus Meyer said. Meyer had flown since 1939, survived Poland, France, Britain, Russia. Now he looked like an old man at 27. "They have more pilots, more aircraft, more fuel, more everything. And these new Mustangs, they're faster than us, they climb better than us, and they never leave. They're always there." Stigler didn't respond. What could he say? That Germany was losing, everyone knew it. That the Luftwaffe was being destroyed. The casualty lists proved it. That no amount of courage or skill could overcome industrial capacity when one side could build 3 fighters for everyone you destroyed. He thought about the bomber pilot he'd let escape to Sweden in December. Wondered if the man had made it home. Wondered if he was back in England now, flying more missions protected by Mustangs that Stigler couldn't touch. "What do we do?" Meyer asked. Stigler walked to the window and looked out at the flight line where mechanics worked under floodlights, patching holes, replacing engines, preparing aircraft for tomorrow's slaughter. "We do our duty. We protect our cities. We fight until we can't fight anymore. And we remember that we're not Nazis. We're pilots defending our home." Meyer nodded slowly. It was the only answer that made sense, even though they both knew it meant they were probably going to die defending a regime they didn't believe in, protecting a cause that was already lost. But honor demanded you fight anyway, even when reason said the fight was pointless. That's what separated soldiers from murderers, the ability to distinguish between duty to nation and loyalty to criminals. At 8th Air Force Headquarters, Ira Eaker studied the latest mission reports with something approaching hope for the first time in months. March losses down 40% from February. April losses, if the trend continued, might drop another 30%. The Mustangs weren't just escorting bombers. They were hunting German fighters wherever they could be found, destroying them on the ground at their airfields, killing experienced pilots faster than German flight schools could replace them. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't chivalrous. It was industrial warfare applied to the sky, and it was working. "How many Mustang groups do we have operational now?" Eaker asked Kepner. 14 squadrons fully equipped and combat ready. Another 8 transitioning from Thunderbolts. By June, we'll have 32 squadrons, almost 800 Mustangs. Eaker did the mathematics in his head. 800 Mustangs, each capable of flying 2 missions per day, each able to reach any target in Germany. The Luftwaffe had maybe 1,200 fighters total defending the Reich, and they were losing 50 to 70 aircraft per week. The war in the air was being won. Not through courage, though there was courage in abundance. Not through individual heroism, though heroes flew every day. It was being won through the same method that won every modern war logistics production and the ruthless application of superior resources. Somewhere over Germany, at that moment, bombers were flying toward their targets protected by silver Mustangs that had once been dismissed as failures. And in factories across America, assembly lines were building more Mustangs crewed by riveting teams that included women who'd never worked outside their homes before Pearl Harbor, driven by a national will that had transformed grief into purpose and purpose into production. The Germans had laughed at the Mustang when it first appeared, dismissed it as another mediocre American design. They weren't laughing anymore. They were dying. The mathematics of destruction reached their logical conclusion on February 20th, 1944, when Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower authorized Operation Argument, a coordinated campaign that bomber crews would remember simply as Big Week. At Thorpe Abbott's, Billy Hartman stood in the pre-dawn darkness outside the briefing room, stamping his feet against the cold and trying not to think about the fact that he'd now flown 19 missions and had 6 more to go before his tour was complete. The statistics said he had a 68% chance of surviving those final 6 missions, which sounded good until you remembered that translated to a 1 in 3 chance of dying. Morrison emerged from the briefing room, his face pale in the artificial light spilling through the doorway. "It's Leipzig, the Erla Maschinenwerk factory, where they build Bf-109s. How many groups? All of them. Every bomber in England that can fly. They're saying maybe 1,000 aircraft, total bombers and escorts together." Hartman felt something shift in his chest, not quite hope, but adjacent to it. 1,000 aircraft. That wasn't a raid. That was an invasion of the sky itself. "What about fighter escort?" Morrison's voice dropped. "All the way to target and back. They've got Mustangs staging out of forward bases. They're saying we'll have continuous coverage the entire mission." For 4 months, bomber crews had flown into Germany, knowing they'd be abandoned at the fighter line left to die alone, while their escorts turned back to England. The psychological toll of that abandonment, watching the P-47s peel away, knowing you were about to be slaughtered, had broken more men than enemy fire ever did. Now they were being told the Mustangs would stay. The question was whether to believe it. Destiny's Child lifted off at 0712 hours, part of a stream of bombers that stretched across the English sky like migrating geese. Hartman counted aircraft as they climbed to formation altitude, 37 B-17s from their group alone. And he could see other groups assembling to the north and south, the entire 8th Air Force converging into a single massive formation. At 12,000 feet, the escorts appeared. Not just a few flights, but entire squadrons of P-51 Mustangs, their polished aluminum skins catching the morning sun like silver knives. They wove above and around the bomber formation in a defensive pattern that Hartman had never seen before, not just protecting, but actively hunting for threats. "Jesus," Morrison whispered. "There must be 200 of them." Chen's voice crackled from the ball turret. "I count at least that, and they're staying with us. They're actually staying." The formation crossed into Germany at 0834 hours. Hartman waited for the familiar dread that came with entering Indian country, but this time was different. The Mustangs didn't peel away. They climbed higher, spread wider, created a defensive bubble that moved with the bombers like a shield. At 0911 hours, German fighters appeared a Jagdgeschwader, forming up 30 miles ahead preparing to attack. Hartman saw them first as dots against the clouds, then as distinct aircraft shapes. His hands tightened on the yoke muscle memory preparing for the violence to come. But before the Germans could attack, the Mustangs dove on them. What happened next didn't feel like combat. It felt like execution. The P-51s came out of the sun in pairs, each pair selecting a target, each attack coordinated and methodical. Hartman watched a Bf-109 explode under concentrated fire, saw another spin away with its tail shot off, saw a third pilot bail out so fast his parachute hadn't fully deployed when he disappeared below the clouds. The German formation disintegrated. Some tried to engage the Mustangs in dogfights and died. Others dove for the deck and were chased down. A few simply fled their pilots, understanding immediately that they were overmatched. The entire engagement lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, 12 German fighters were destroyed and not a single bomber had been touched. "My God," Johnson said from the top turret. "They're killing them. They're just killing them." 3 more times on the way to Leipzig, German fighters tried to attack the formation. 3 more times the Mustangs shredded them before they could get close. By the time Destiny's Child reached the initial point for the bomb run, Hartman had stopped flinching at the sight of enemy aircraft. The Mustangs had created something bomber crews had stopped believing possible safety. The flak over Leipzig was intense black bursts that filled the sky with shrapnel, but flak was predictable, almost comforting in its mechanical impersonality. Flak didn't think, didn't adapt, didn't hunt you through the clouds. You flew through flak and either survived or didn't, and there was something almost peaceful about leaving your fate to pure chance. Kowalski released the bombs at 10:47 hours. The factory below disappeared in smoke and explosions. Secondary explosions suggested they'd hit something critical, fuel storage maybe, or ammunition dumps. Hartman didn't care. He just wanted to go home. The flight back was eerily quiet. No German fighters attacked. The Luftwaffe had either been destroyed or had given up, and Hartman couldn't decide which possibility was more disturbing. They crossed the English coast at 13:18 hours, touched down at Thorpe Abbotts at 13:42 hours. And when the engines finally shut down, Hartman discovered he was crying. "You okay?" Morrison asked. Hartman nodded, unable to speak. He wasn't crying from fear or relief. He was crying because for the first time in 19 missions, he'd flown deep into Germany and come home without watching friends die. The absence of death felt like a betrayal of everyone who died on previous missions, as if their sacrifice had been pointless because safety had been possible all along. That night, intelligence officers compiled the results from Big Week. Over 6 days, the 8th Air Force had flown more than 3,000 bomber sorties and 6,000 fighter sorties into Germany. They'd destroyed 516 Luftwaffe aircraft in the air and 274 on the ground. They'd demolished 11 major aircraft factories and damaged dozens more. And they'd lost 226 bombers, a 25% loss rate that would have been catastrophic in any previous raid, but now felt almost acceptable because the German losses were so much worse. The Luftwaffe had lost not just aircraft, but pilots. Experienced pilots who couldn't be replaced. Men who'd survived 4 years of war only to die in the final months, because they were flying obsolete tactics in inferior aircraft against an enemy who'd solved the fundamental problem of modern air warfare: how to project power at range. At Jever Airfield, Franz Stigler sat in the operations room staring at casualty lists that read like cemetery registers. His squadron had lost 11 pilots in 6 days, 11 men he'd trained with, flown with, drunk with. The replacement pilots arriving from flight schools had barely 50 hours in their aircraft. They died within days, sometimes hours of their first combat mission. "We can't keep doing this," Hauptmann Meyer said, his voice hollow. "We're feeding children to wolves." Stigler didn't answer. What was there to say? That the war was lost. Everyone knew. That they should surrender. To what unconditional surrender? War crimes, trials, national humiliation. The Nazi leadership had made certain that Germany would fight to total destruction rather than face accountability for what they'd done. "How many combat-ready aircraft do we have?" Stigler asked the operations officer. 8, maybe 9, if maintenance can patch the hydraulics on Yellow 7. 8 aircraft. Stigler laughed bitterly. "We started the month with 24. Through the window, he could see the flight line where maintenance crews worked under floodlights. But there was a defeated quality to their movements now, a recognition that no amount of mechanical skill could fix what was fundamentally broken: Germany's ability to contest the skies. On March 4, 1944, Berlin was bombed in daylight for the first time. 668 B-17s and B-24s, escorted by 891 fighters, flew directly over the German capital and destroyed the Erkner ball bearing plant, the Bosch electrical works, and the Daimler-Benz tank engine factory. German fighters managed to shoot down 79 bombers, but they lost 160 aircraft in return, a kill ratio that was strategically catastrophic. Adolf Galland flew his last combat mission that day. He shot down 2 B-17s, watched 5 of his pilots die, and landed at Tempelhof with his aircraft so shot up that ground crews declared it scrap metal. That night, he submitted a report to Hermann Göring that he knew would end his career. "The Reichsmarschall must understand that we have lost air superiority over the Reich. The American Mustang has rendered our defensive strategy obsolete. We can no longer protect our cities, our factories, or our people. I estimate the Luftwaffe will cease to exist as an effective fighting force within 90 days unless we receive the Me-262 jet fighter in sufficient numbers to counter the numerical superiority of Allied conventional fighters. This is not defeatism. This is mathematics." Göring's response arrived by courier the next morning. "You are relieved of command, effective immediately. Report to Berlin for administrative duties. Your successor will be an officer who understands that victory is a matter of will, not machinery." Galland packed his personal effects, said goodbye to pilots he'd commanded for 3 years, and left for Berlin, knowing that the men he was leaving behind would die in aircraft that were inferior to what they faced, following tactics that no longer worked, defending a regime that had already lost. At Debden, Don Gentile was painting his 27th kill, marking on his Mustang's fuselage, when his squadron commander, Major James Howard, walked over with orders. "Higher wants us to start offensive patrols. Not escorting bombers hunting German fighters wherever we can find them. Airfields, training bases, anywhere they're vulnerable." Gentile stepped back from his aircraft and studied the kill markings. 27 German aircraft destroyed. Each marking represented a pilot, killed a family, destroyed, a life ended. He'd stopped thinking about that around kill 15. You couldn't function in combat if you thought too much about the human cost of what you were doing. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow. We're hitting the training base at Herzogenaurach. Intelligence says they're using it to transition new pilots onto the FW-190. We're going to catch them on the ground before they ever see combat." The mission launched at 0630 hours on March 11th. 16 Mustangs flying at deck level to avoid radar, navigating by landmarks and dead reckoning. They found Herzogenaurach exactly where intelligence said it would be, a grass airfield, with 30 aircraft parked in neat rows waiting to be flown. Gentile led the first pass. He came in low and fast, his 6 machine guns tearing through aircraft that couldn't shoot back, destroying them before their engines were even warm. Fuel tanks exploded, canopies shattered, ground crews scattered. On the second pass, some Germans tried to get airborne. Gentile shot down 3 FW-190s before they cleared 100 feet altitude. They crashed and burned at the end of the runway, blocking anyone else from taking off. When his squadron finally departed, 28 German aircraft were destroyed, and Herzogenaurach was burning. They'd lost one Mustang to ground fire. The pilot had bailed out over friendly territory and would be back in combat within a week. Flying home, Gentile felt nothing. No triumph, no guilt, just a hollow recognition that this was what winning looked like in industrial warfare. You destroyed the enemy's capacity to fight before they ever reached the battlefield. You killed them in their training bases, at their factories, on their airfields. You made combat so one-sided that resistance became suicide. It was efficient. It was ruthless. And it was ending the war faster than any other strategy could. But that night, lying in his bunk, Gentile thought about the German pilots he'd killed that morning, boys probably barely out of flight school sitting in aircraft that hadn't even been armed yet. They'd died without firing a shot, without any chance to fight back. He told himself it didn't matter. That war was war that Germany had started it. That every German pilot he killed was one less pilot trying to kill American bombers. But the logic felt hollow in the darkness, and sleep didn't come easy. By April 1944, the Luftwaffe was dying. Not from lack of courage, German pilots still fought with desperate bravery. Not from lack of aircraft factories were still producing fighters. But from lack of fuel, lack of experienced pilots, and lack of any answer to the Mustang's combination of range, speed, and numbers. The Silver Fighters were everywhere now, hunting from England to Poland, from Norway to Italy. And German pilots who'd once owned the sky were learning what it felt like to be prey. Billy Hartman completed his 25th mission on April 18, 1944, escorted all the way to the target and back by Mustangs that had become so omnipresent in German skies that bomber crews no longer bothered counting them. They were just there, always a silver wall between death and home. The intelligence officer who debriefed him asked the standard questions about enemy aircraft, flak intensity, bomb damage, assessment. Hartman answered mechanically, his mind already somewhere else, already back in Ohio, already trying to remember what civilian life felt like. When the debriefing ended, the officer shook his hand and said, "You're done. You get to go home." Hartman walked out into the English spring afternoon and felt absolutely nothing. Not relief, not joy, just a profound emptiness where emotion should have been. He'd survived when so many hadn't, and the randomness of that survival felt obscene. Tommy Chen was dead. 160 men from that single Schweinfurt mission were dead. Thousands more across the 8th Air Force were dead. And Billy Hartman was going home to Ohio, where people would call him a hero, without understanding that heroes were the ones who didn't make it back. Morrison found him sitting alone behind the barracks, staring at nothing. "You okay?" "They're giving me the Distinguished Flying Cross," Hartman said. "For what?" "For not dying. For being lucky." Morrison sat down beside him, pulled out a pack of cigarettes, offered one. They smoked in silence for a while, watching maintenance crews work on bombers that would fly tomorrow with different crews continuing the war that had become mechanical and inevitable. "You know what I think about," Morrison said finally. "I think about all those missions in January and February when we flew into Germany knowing we'd be alone, knowing the escorts would leave and the Germans would come. And I think about how many guys died just because we didn't have the right airplane yet. The Mustang existed. It was sitting in warehouses in Ohio while we were getting slaughtered over Schweinfurt. If they'd just gotten it to us 6 months earlier—" "Don't," Hartman interrupted. "Don't do that to yourself. You can't think about the what-ifs, or you'll go insane." But Morrison was right, and they both knew it. The P-51 Mustang had existed since 1942, sitting unwanted in hangars because the Army Air Force didn't recognize what they had. It took British engineers to see the potential, took catastrophic losses to force American brass to pay attention, and by the time Mustangs finally reached operational squadrons, thousands of men had already died in aircraft that couldn't protect them. History would remember the Mustang as the fighter that won the air war. History wouldn't mention the men who died waiting for it to arrive. On June 6, 1944, 12,000 Allied aircraft filled the sky over Normandy, and at the heart of that aerial armada were the Mustangs flying continuous patrols that ensured German fighters never reached the beaches where American soldiers were dying in the surf. Captain Charles McGee of the 332nd Fighter Group flew 4 missions that day, each time returning to base just long enough to refuel and rearm before launching again. On his 3rd mission, he encountered 6 Bf-109s trying to strafe the landing craft, bringing reinforcements ashore. McGee's flight of 4 Mustangs intercepted them 5 miles inland. The fight was brief and brutal. McGee shot down 2 German fighters in the first 30 seconds. His wingman got another. The remaining 3 Germans tried to flee, but there was nowhere to run. Mustangs filled the sky in every direction, and the Luftwaffe pilots who survived long enough to bail out landed in territory controlled by soldiers who'd just watched their friends die on the beach. When McGee landed that evening, his crew chief counted 73 bullet holes in his aircraft. "You're lucky to be alive, Captain." McGee climbed out of the cockpit and looked at the damage with detachment. Luck wasn't the right word anymore. Skill mattered, tactics mattered, but mostly what mattered was that America had built so many Mustangs and trained so many pilots that individual survival became a numbers game. The Luftwaffe couldn't kill them all because there were simply too many targets. "Not luck," McGee said. "Mathematics." By August 1944, the Luftwaffe had essentially ceased to exist as an offensive force. They still had aircraft, still had pilots, but fuel shortages meant many fighters never left the ground. Those that did fly faced overwhelming numbers. 800 operational Mustangs in the European theater, flown by pilots who'd been training for 18 months, while German replacement pilots received barely 50 hours of instruction before being thrown into combat. Franz Stigler flew his last mission on September 12, 1944. His squadron, now reduced to 4 aircraft, was ordered to intercept American bombers heading to Munich. They climbed to intercept altitude and found themselves facing 40 Mustangs with no bombers in sight. The Mustangs weren't escorting anymore. They were hunting. Stigler saw the trap immediately. He called to break off, but 2 of his pilots had already committed to the attack. The Mustangs rolled in from above and, behind textbook tactics, executed with machine precision. Both German fighters went down in flames within seconds. Stigler and his remaining wingman dove for the deck, running for their lives at full throttle. The Mustangs followed. They were faster, could dive, faster, could catch anything in the sky. Stigler's wingman took hits and crashed into a forest. Stigler kept running, kept dodging, kept waiting to feel bullets tear through his cockpit. But they never came. The Mustangs broke off, apparently satisfied with 2 kills, and Stigler made it back to base with his fuel gauge reading empty, and his hands shaking so badly he could barely taxi. He walked into the operations office, took off his flight gear, and told the commanding officer, "I'm done. Court-martial me if you want, but I'm not flying anymore. This isn't combat, it's suicide." The officer looked at him with exhausted eyes. "You have family. A sister in Hamburg. Go to her. The war's lost anyway. Better you survive to rebuild than die defending ashes." Stigler left that afternoon, abandoning his uniform, his medals, his Knight's Cross. He'd fought honorably for a dishonorable regime, and now all he wanted was to survive long enough to see what came after the wreckage. On April 7, 1945, Billy Hartman, who'd gone home, who'd tried to forget who'd failed at both, was working at his father's hardware store in Piqua, Ohio, when he heard about the Me-262 jets. The Germans had finally deployed their wonder weapon, the jet fighter, that was supposed to turn the tide. Intelligence reported they had maybe 200 operational aircraft. America had 3,900 P-51 Mustangs in theater. The mathematics hadn't changed. The jets were faster, better armed, technologically superior. But there weren't enough of them. They were plagued by engine failures, and they needed long runways that Mustangs could strafe with impunity. German pilots would take off in their jets and be shot down before they could retract their landing gear. Hartman felt no satisfaction hearing this. Just a dull recognition that the war he'd fought was ending the way it always had to end, through exhaustion, through overwhelming force, through the simple arithmetic of production that said democracy could build faster than dictatorship could destroy. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe ended. The final accounting showed the 8th Air Force had lost 4,700 bombers and 3,300 fighters. 50,000 American airmen dead or captured. The Luftwaffe had lost 70,000 aircraft and 100,000 personnel. The P-51 Mustang was officially credited with 4 950 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat and 131 destroyed on the ground. More than any other Allied fighter. More than enough to prove that the airplane dismissed as a failure in 1942 had become the weapon that made victory possible. But numbers couldn't capture what the Mustang had really accomplished. It hadn't just destroyed German aircraft, it had destroyed German hope. It had taken the one domain where Germany still competed and turned it into another theater of American industrial dominance. It had proven that courage and skill couldn't overcome logistics and production. Don Gentile finished the war with 22 aerial victories officially credited, though he believed the real number was higher. He returned to Ohio, tried flying commercially, couldn't adjust to the tedium of peacetime aviation. On January 28, 1951, he was killed testing an F-86 Sabre at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the same airfield where officers had once stood around a Mustang prototype and called it worthless. Charles McGee continued flying. Korea, Vietnam. He retired as a colonel in 1973 with 409 combat missions across 3 wars. When asked what he remembered most about flying Mustangs, he said simply, "It gave us a chance. Before the Mustang bomber crews were being slaughtered, and there was nothing we could do to help them. After the Mustang, we could stay with them. We could protect them. That's all any of us wanted, just a chance to do our job." Franz Stigler survived the war, worked as a commercial pilot, and tried to forget the men he'd killed. On December 20, 1990, 47 years after he'd escorted that damaged B-17 to safety, he received a letter from a man named Charlie Brown, the pilot of that bomber who'd spent decades searching for the German pilot who'd saved his life. They met in person, became friends, and spent their final years speaking at schools together, telling students that even in the middle of the worst war in human history, honor still mattered. That you could be enemies and still be human beings. That the machinery of war didn't erase individual moral choice. Stigler died in 2008. Brown died 8 months later. At both funerals, their families stood together, connected by a moment of mercy that had survived decades after the war that created it. The P-51 Mustang continued flying long after World War II ended. In Korea. In smaller wars. With civilian racing enthusiasts who recognized the aircraft's beauty. The last combat-capable Mustangs weren't retired until 1984, 42 years after the prototype first flew. You can still see them today at air shows restored to immaculate condition, flown by pilots who understand they're not just operating an aircraft, but embodying a moment when American engineering solved a problem that was killing thousands. When the right engine met the right airframe at the right moment in history and changed everything. The men who flew them are mostly gone now. Billy Hartman died in 1993. James Morrison in 2001. Robert Chen in 2006. Marcus Johnson in 2011. Each obituary mentioned their military service, their decorations, their contribution to victory. None mentioned the nightmares, the survivors' guilt, the way they'd flinch at loud noises for the rest of their lives. But their children remember, their grandchildren remember, and people like you reading this now keep their story alive by refusing to let history become abstraction, by insisting that the numbers represent human beings who laughed and feared and died far from home. The P-51 Mustang was built in factories by workers who'd never assembled an aircraft before Pearl Harbor. It was flown by pilots who'd been college students and farm boys and mechanics before the war called them to service. It was maintained by ground crews working 18-hour shifts in English mud and Italian dust. It was a collective achievement, not the work of a single genius or hero. That's the real lesson of the Mustang. Not that America built a superior fighter, though they did. But that democracy, when threatened, can transform itself into something powerful enough to defeat tyranny. That free people building weapons to defend freedom will always outproduce slaves building weapons for conquest. That the arc of history bends toward justice when enough ordinary people decide to bend it. The Germans laughed at the Mustang when it first appeared. They stopped laughing when it shot down 5,000 of their aircraft and took control of their sky. But this isn't a story about German defeat. It's a story about what happens when engineers refuse to accept failure, when pilots refuse to abandon bomber crews, when a nation decides that victory matters more than profit or convenience or comfort. It's a story about the way wars are actually won, not through individual heroism, though heroes flew every day, but through logistics production and the unglamorous work of building enough of the right weapon at the right time. If you believe their names deserve to be remembered, share this story. Write a name in the comments below, a veteran you knew, a relative who served, anyone who deserves to have their service acknowledged. Because the P-51 Mustang may have won the air war, but it was the men inside those silver aircraft who won the peace. And as long as we remember them, they're still winning.